A border village in Ukraine's Sumy region has suddenly become the center of a chilling allegation. Ukraine says Russian forces crossed in, rounded up civilians, and carried them into Russia. Not prisoners of war, not combatants. Civilians, many described as elderly. And tonight, Kyiv is pressing the International Committee of the Red Cross to help establish where they are and to push for contact, access, and a path home. If the claim is accurate, it is a reminder of how this war can turn ordinary lives into leverage overnight. One day you are in your home near a quiet line on a map. The next, you are across a border without a phone, without a message to your family, and without a clear legal status anyone can verify from the outside. Ukrainian officials say the incident centered on the village of Hrabovske, right along the northeastern frontier. Ukraine's Human Rights Commissioner, Dmytro Lubinets, says it was preliminarily established that Russian troops illegally detained about 50 civilians there on December 18, held them without communication and in poor conditions, and then forcibly transported them into Russia on December 20. Lubinets says he appealed directly to Russia's Human Rights Commissioner, Tatyana Moskalkova, demanding information on the civilians' whereabouts, their conditions, and immediate measures to return them safely. He also says he sent an official letter to the International Committee of the Red Cross, urging the organization to act within its mandate and to press for clarity, access, and accountability. Ukraine's messaging is pointed. These people, Kyiv says, were not evacuated. They were taken. And because the alleged transfer crossed an international border and involved civilians, Ukraine argues it is not simply a battlefield incident, but an issue of international humanitarian law and potentially of war crimes, depending on the facts and intent. Ukraine's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, also weighed in publicly, calling for an international response and demanding the return of what he called civilian hostages. He described the alleged raid as a medieval-style seizure and framed it as proof, in his words, of the constant threat of living next to Russia, while urging stronger security guarantees for Ukraine. From Moscow, there has been no publicly verified, detailed response to this specific allegation that would allow independent confirmation. That gap matters because Sumy is an active and contested region where claims can be hard to verify quickly and where information is often fragmented by combat conditions and security limits. And outside observers have already flagged that uncertainty. In its reporting on the broader diplomatic context, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty noted that the situation in Sumy remained unclear and that details could not immediately be confirmed independently. So what is known and what is not? Known is what Ukraine says, with specific dates in a specific village. Known is that Ukraine has formally asked the Red Cross to intervene within its humanitarian role. Not known publicly is any verified list of names, their exact location inside Russia, the authority holding them, or whether they have been registered in any system that would allow families to receive confirmation they are alive. And the stakes here are painfully simple. When civilians are moved and held without contact, the first fear is disappearance. The second fear is coercion. The third fear is time, because every day without contact makes it harder to trace people, harder to verify conditions, and harder to prevent abuse. To understand why Sumy is so vulnerable to this kind of episode, you have to picture the geography. This is northeastern Ukraine, a long border facing Russia, with villages scattered close to crossing routes and tree lines. The region has seen persistent attacks and infiltrations during the war, even when the main thrust of ground fighting shifted elsewhere. In border areas, the front line is often not a trench. It is a road, a field, a neighborhood. That matters because border warfare creates a particular kind of chaos. Evacuations happen in bursts, communications fail. Residents stay behind for many reasons: age, poverty, disability, attachment to home, fear of looting, fear of the unknown. And when small settlements are hit by raids, drones, or sudden advances, civilians can be trapped in the middle before larger authorities can respond. Here is the key question that follows every such allegation. What, under the laws of war, is allowed, and what crosses the line? International humanitarian law gives special protections to civilians, including rules around detention, treatment, family contact, and transfer. Forcible transfer and deportation of civilians from occupied territory can constitute serious violations, depending on circumstances and legal definition. The UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has already documented patterns of deportations and transfers in other contexts. In an October 2025 press release tied to its report to the UN General Assembly, the Commission said Russian authorities coordinated actions that amounted to war crimes of deportation or transfer of civilians from areas under their control in Zaporizhia. And it described coercive practices, including detention and document confiscation. Separately, the UN Human Rights Office has also documented the risks surrounding civilian detention in occupied areas, including the vulnerability of families who receive little or no information. In a September 2025 press release about a UN human rights report, the office said many released civilian detainees described severe ill treatment and poor detention conditions, and it warned that disregard for legal safeguards has raised concerns about enforced disappearances, leaving families with limited information about loved ones' fate. Ochre+1, those findings do not prove what happened in Hrabovske, but they provide a framework for why Ukraine's allegation is resonating so sharply. The core fear is not only that civilians were moved, but that they may be held outside any transparent system, beyond oversight, and beyond regular family contact. This is where the Red Cross comes in, and also where public expectations often collide with what humanitarian organizations can actually do. The International Committee of the Red Cross has a mandate under the laws of armed conflict to work for the protection and humane treatment of detainees, to help restore family links, and to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing persons. It also operates a central tracing agency system intended to prevent disappearances and help families get answers. In fact, the ICRC has built a dedicated central tracing agency bureau for the Russia-Ukraine war, designed to act as a neutral intermediary and to collect and transmit information on military personnel and civilians who have fallen into the hands of the enemy, aiming to ensure they are accounted for and can retain family links. But there is another reality that needs to be said out loud. The ICRC ability to visit detainees and confirm conditions depends on access, and access depends on cooperation from the authorities holding those people. The ICRC can press, request, and negotiate. It can register individuals when it is allowed to. It can facilitate family messages. It can document needs and raise concerns confidentially with detaining powers, but it cannot simply cross a border and demand entry to a facility without permission. The ICRC itself describes why detention work matters. In conflict, detainees are acutely vulnerable to forced disappearance, ill treatment, and loss of family contact. And the organization says its visits aim to prevent torture and disappearances, improve detention conditions, restore contact with families, and ensure respect for legal safeguards. And the scale of the missing persons challenge in this war is already enormous. Reuters reported in February 2025 that the ICRC said the number of missing people documented in the war had doubled to around 50,000 cases over the past year, that about 90% were servicemen and women, and that the ICRC disclosed it had received 16,000 notifications from Russia and Ukraine about people being held by each side since 2022. Reuters' That Context explains two things at once. First, why families and governments keep pushing the Red Cross, because it is one of the few actors with a recognized role across front lines. Second, why results can be painfully slow, because the process is built on negotiation, verification, and cooperation, all of which are strained in a war defined by distrust. So if you are watching this story and asking, what does it mean to say the Red Cross is being pressed? The answer is this. Ukraine is trying to force a humanitarian process into motion quickly, before this case becomes another set of names swallowed into a larger missing persons crisis. It wants the ICRC to seek confirmation, to request access, and to obtain proof of life or location that families can rely on. There is also a political backdrop. The allegations surfaced as diplomatic contacts were still being described as constructive, but inconclusive, and as both sides continued to posture over what any peace process should look like. In that atmosphere, accusations about civilians being taken across borders can harden public opinion and shrink the space for compromise because they speak directly to fear, morality, and trust. And that is why this story is bigger than one village. If civilians can be seized during a brief advance or raid, it changes how other communities perceive evacuation orders. It changes how local officials assess risk. It changes what families are willing to do when they hear distant artillery. Do you stay hoping the front passes you by, or do you leave, even if it means abandoning everything? It also places pressure on international actors to respond with something more than statements. In practical terms, the most immediate humanitarian priorities are straightforward. Confirmation of where these civilians are, whether they are alive, whether they are together, whether they have medical care, and whether they are allowed to communicate with relatives. Then comes the legal and diplomatic layer. Russia has repeatedly denied committing war crimes and has rejected the legitimacy of certain international legal action. Reuters has reported, for example, that the Kremlin has said Russia does not recognize ICC arrest warrants, pointing to Russia not being a party to the Rome Statute, and that Moscow has dismissed previous ICE warrants as biased. That same Reuters report also noted that the ICE issued warrants in 2023 related to alleged war crimes tied to the abduction of Ukrainian children, a claim the Kremlin has rejected. Again, that does not settle what happened in Hrabovske, but it does help explain why Ukraine is pushing the Red Cross so aggressively. If legal processes are slow and contested, and if political negotiations stall, humanitarian tracing can become the fastest available pathway to basic answers. So what happens next, and what should you watch for? First, any acknowledgement from Russian officials, even indirect, about whether these civilians are in custody and under what authority. Second, any indication that the ICRC has been granted access or has been able to register the individuals or, at minimum, obtain proof of life and deliver family messages. Third, any lists of names provided by Ukrainian authorities or local officials, because verification begins with identity. Fourth, watch the operational picture around Sumy. If the area remains unstable, it may limit journalists' access and complicate independent verification. But if residents who fled can provide consistent accounts, if local administrations release details, or if corroborating evidence emerges, the allegation may become clearer. And finally, watch for the human signals that often come before official ones. Families reporting a first phone call, a first message passed through intermediaries, a first confirmation from a tracing system. In wars, that one line, "I am alive," can become the dividing point between fear and certainty. For now, the core fact is this. Ukraine says roughly 50 civilians from Hrabovske and Sumy were detained on December 18 and transported into Russia on December 20, and Kyiv has formally appealed to the Red Cross to help locate them and press for their return. The outside world cannot independently confirm the full details yet, and Russia has not provided publicly verifiable clarity. But the moral urgency does not wait for perfect information. Civilians are not bargaining chips under the laws of war. Families have a right to know where their loved ones are. And any credible system of humanitarian protection depends on one basic principle, that people do not simply vanish across a border. In the coming days, the question will not only be what happened in one village, but whether the mechanisms meant to prevent disappearances can work under the pressures of this conflict. Because if they cannot, the battlefield expands beyond territory. It expands into the most intimate space of all, the bond between a family and the certainty that their missing are still somewhere, still reachable, still protected by law.